At 6 o'clock in the morning, on the 6th of October 1973, Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, Egyptian and Syrian forces launched simultaneous attacks across two fronts against Israel. The assault caught Israel almost entirely unprepared. Within the first hours, Egypt's Third Army had crossed the Suez Canal and overrun the Bar-Lev defensive line. Syrian armor was advancing across the Golan Heights. What followed over the next 19 days would change not only the military map of the Middle East, but the financial architecture of the entire world, in ways that no general, no foreign minister, and no economist fully anticipated. The Yom Kippur War produced the most consequential economic weapon of the 20th century. Not a tank, not a missile. A decision made around a conference table in Kuwait City on the 17th of October 1973 by the oil ministers of the Arab member states of OPEC. They agreed to cut oil production by 5% per month until Israel withdrew from the territories it had occupied since 1967. Within 2 days, they had gone further. A total embargo was placed on oil shipments to the United States and the Netherlands. Other Western nations received graduated reductions. The price of oil had stood at $2.90 per barrel before the war. By January 1974, it reached $11.65, a four-fold increase in less than 90 days. This was not a market movement, it was a geopolitical decision, and it permanently altered the relationship between energy, money, and power. To understand why the oil weapon worked in 1973, when it had failed in 1967, you have to understand the conditions that had developed in the intervening years. By 1973, the United States was importing nearly 1/3 of its petroleum. Western Europe was more exposed still. Imported oil accounted for more than 55% of the continent's total energy consumption. Japan was the most dependent of all. Nearly 70% of its energy came from imported oil, almost entirely from the Persian Gulf. These were not figures that had crept up gradually and unnoticed. They were the deliberate result of post-war industrial policy. Oil was cheap, coal was expensive, and rebuilding economies chose the cheapest available fuel. The second condition was the exhaustion of American spare production capacity. By 1973, American domestic oil output had declined to 16% of global supply. The days when Texas could turn the taps and flood the market to break any Arab price action were over. The third was the leadership of King Faisal of Saudi Arabia. For years, Faisal had resisted pressure from the more radical Arab states to use oil as a political instrument. That position changed in August 1973 when Faisal met with Egyptian President Anwar Sadat in Riyadh. What passed between them remained private. What followed was not. His instrument was Sheikh Ahmed Zaki Yamani, Saudi Arabia's oil minister since 1962, a Harvard-trained lawyer of exceptional intelligence and one of the most effective communicators in the history of international commodity politics. Yamani made the embargo comprehensible to the Western press, managed the internal tensions within OPEC, and executed a strategy of graduated pressure that maximized economic impact whilst leaving room for diplomatic resolution. Before we go further, if this kind of history matters to you, consider subscribing to the channel. Every video here is built around the financial decisions that actually changed the world. The crises, the policy failures, the moments when the system revealed what it was designed to protect. If that is the kind of analysis you want to keep watching, the subscribe button is how you tell us, and we want to hear from you. Did you live through one of these turning points? The 2008 collapse? The 70s oil shock? The end of Bretton Woods? Did it change your family's circumstances? Your understanding of how money actually works? Leave it in the comments. The most complete record of these events is not in any official report. It is in the people who are paying attention. Now, back to the account. The embargo was not inevitable. It escalated in response to a specific sequence of American decisions, and it struck at precisely the moment when America was most financially exposed. When the Yom Kippur War began, Nixon and Kissinger sought to avoid direct involvement, wary of antagonizing Arab oil producers. American military supplies to Israel were delayed whilst the Soviets actively resupplied Egypt and Syria. It was only when Prime Minister Golda Meir sent a desperate appeal to Washington that the calculation changed. On the 12th of October, the United States initiated Operation Nickel Grass, a massive strategic airlift delivering hundreds of tons of ammunition, tanks, and aircraft to Israel. 7 days later, Nixon formally requested Congress to make available $2.2 billion in emergency military assistance. On the 20th of October, Saudi Arabia declared a total embargo. Libya, Kuwait, and the other Gulf states followed within 48 hours. But the reason this embargo hit differently from 1967 lies in a decision made 2 years earlier. When Nixon closed the gold window in August 1971, he severed the link between the dollar and gold. The dollar began to decline. Since oil was priced in dollars, Arab producers were receiving less real purchasing power for every barrel they sold. By 1972, OPEC nations were watching their revenues erode. Some members began discussing pricing oil in gold rather than dollars. The price increases of October 1973 were in part compensation for 2 years of dollar debasement. Most accounts of the 1973 oil crisis omit this connection entirely. The Yom Kippur War provided the political trigger, but the economic conditions that made a fourfold price increase feel justified, even necessary, to the producing nations had been building since August 15, 1971. The Federal Reserve Chairman Arthur Burns understood the linkage. In his 1974 congressional testimony, he described the oil shock as arriving at a most inopportune time, intersecting with inflation already generated by the collapse of dollar discipline. Consumer prices in the United States rose at an annual rate of 8.7% in 1973. In 1974, they reached 11%. The result was stagflation, the unprecedented combination of high inflation and economic stagnation that would define the decade. Henry Kissinger spent the winter of 1973 to 1974 running 2 parallel negotiations that, taken together, produced one of the most consequential financial arrangements of the 20th century. The first was a diplomatic settlement of the Yom Kippur War. Kissinger conducted the shuttle diplomacy for which he became famous, flying between Cairo, Tel Aviv, Riyadh, and Damascus, brokering the disengagement agreements that pulled Israeli and Egyptian forces back from their most exposed positions. By January 1974, the immediate military crisis was sufficiently resolved to give the Arab states the political cover to end the embargo without appearing to have capitulated. In March 1974, OPEC officially lifted the embargo. The oil price did not return to $2.90 per barrel. It remained near $11.65. The embargo had been short 5 months, but the price it established was permanent. The second negotiation was less visible but more durable. Kissinger understood that Nixon's abandonment of gold in 1971 had left the dollar without an anchor. He also understood that oil was now the world's most essential traded commodity, and that a commodity priced in dollars and purchased by every industrial nation would create sustained global demand for dollars regardless of gold. In June 1974, the United States and Saudi Arabia established the Joint Commission on Economic Cooperation, the formal architecture of what became known as the petrodollar system. The arrangement was straightforward. Saudi Arabia and the broader OPEC membership would price and sell their oil exclusively in US dollars. The surplus revenues accumulated by oil exporting states, revenues too large to invest domestically, would be recycled back into US Treasury securities and American financial markets. In return, the United States would provide military security guarantees and weapons sales to the Gulf monarchies. It was a deal that replaced gold with oil. The dollar was no longer backed by the metal in Fort Knox. It was backed by the fuel in every car, factory, and aircraft in the world. By 1975, every barrel of oil sold on international markets was priced in dollars. Between 1974 and 1981, OPEC member states accumulated a current account surplus of $450 billion. 90% of this surplus was concentrated in the Arab countries of the Persian Gulf and Libya. It was the largest and fastest accumulation of financial wealth in human history to that point. These petrodollars could not be invested domestically. The Gulf states' populations were too small, their industrial bases too limited, and the development projects they could absorb far smaller than the revenues flowing in. The money had to go somewhere. It went, in enormous quantities, into U.S. Treasury securities, into American, European, and British commercial banks, into sovereign wealth funds that would quietly acquire stakes in major corporations around the world, into development projects from Pakistan to Brazil, financed by loans from the international banks that had received the initial petrodollar deposits. The commercial banking consequences were immediate and profound. The major American and European banks were suddenly receiving tens of billions of dollars in new deposits, money they were required to put to work. They found borrowers in the developing world, countries in Latin America, Africa, and Asia that had been locked out of international capital markets were now offered loans at attractive rates. Banks competed to lend. The terms became generous. The caution receded. This was the capital that produced the Latin American debt crisis of 1982, when the Federal Reserve raised interest rates to record levels in 1979 and 1981, peaking at 20%. The dollar strengthened sharply. Developing world debts, denominated in dollars, became suddenly and catastrophically expensive to service. Mexico declared in August 1982 that it could not meet its debt obligations. Brazil and Argentina followed. The debt crisis that engulfed Latin America throughout the 1980s was the delayed consequence of petrodollar recycling through under-regulated commercial banks. A decision made in Kuwait City in October 1973 had produced, through a chain of financial consequences that nobody fully traced at the time, economic devastation across an entire continent a decade later. The oil embargo did something that decades of economic argument had failed to do. It forced the industrialized world to reckon seriously with its energy dependency. The immediate policy responses were visible within months. Nixon announced Project Independence in November 1973. An aspiration to achieve American energy self-sufficiency. The speed limit on American highways was reduced to 55 miles per hour, a measure estimated to save 700,000 barrels of oil per day. In Europe, car-free Sundays were instituted in the Netherlands, Belgium, and West Germany. In Japan, corporate Japan began the decades-long program of manufacturing efficiency that would eventually make Japanese industrial processes the most energy efficient in the world. The International Energy Agency was established in 1974 specifically to coordinate Western responses to future supply disruptions. It exists today, but the deeper transformation was structural and permanent. For the previous 3 decades, the global oil price had been set by the 7 major Western oil companies, the 7 Sisters as they were known: British Petroleum, Shell, Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, Texaco, and Gulf Oil controlled exploration, production, refining, and distribution. In the early 1970s, the producing nations had been nationalizing their oil industries one by one. The embargo accelerated this process and validated it completely. By the mid-1970s, the price of oil was set not by Western corporate boards, but by OPEC ministers meeting in Vienna. The 7 Sisters retained their technical expertise and their downstream networks. They were no longer the price setters of the most traded commodity in the world. That power had shifted to a different set of capitals: Riyadh, Kuwait City, Abu Dhabi, Baghdad. In the span of 5 months, a group of nations that had previously been price takers in a market controlled by Western corporations had become the price setters of the global economy. The financial architecture of the entire industrial world was restructured around that single fact. The 1973 oil embargo lasted 5 months. Its consequences lasted 50 years and continue. The petrodollar system that Kissinger constructed from the ashes of the embargo gave the dollar a new anchor after Nixon removed the old one. It was an anchor that depended not on American gold reserves, but on the universal necessity of oil, and on a bilateral security agreement with Saudi Arabia. The global demand for dollars this created was the mechanism that allowed the United States to run persistent trade deficits without the currency collapsing, to import far more than it exported, financed by the rest of the world's need to hold dollars. This privilege, described by the French as exorbitant long before the oil embargo, became structurally embedded after 1974 in a way it never had been before. The gold anchor had been a constraint on American monetary behavior. The oil anchor was self-reinforcing. The more the world depended on oil, the more it depended on dollars. The more it depended on dollars, the more it needed American financial markets. The more it needed American financial markets, the more difficult it became to challenge the system. The cracks have been visible for some years. In 2022, Saudi Arabia confirmed it was considering accepting yuan from China for some oil sales. The BRICS nations have been developing alternative settlement frameworks. Russia, removed from the dollar system by sanctions after 2022, has been trading energy in rubles and yuan. India has purchased Russian oil in rupees. The infrastructure of de-dollarization is being built quietly, using the same geopolitical logic that Kissinger employed in 1974, but operating in reverse. The 1973 oil embargo was the pivot between two monetary worlds. It ended the gold era. It created the oil era. What replaces the oil era, and when, is the question that makes the events of that October in Kuwait City still relevant today. If this account has given you a clearer understanding of how financial power actually operates, subscribe to the channel. There are more crises, more decisions, more turning points still to document. And if this period of history connects to something you lived through, or something a family member witnessed, the bank runs, the inflation, the austerity, the moment a system everyone trusted stopped working, tell us in the comments, what did they see? What did it cost them? What did they believe afterwards? The official version of these events is always written by the institutions that survived them. The fuller version belongs to the people who did not.